This video is sponsored by World of Warships. Marshall D. Teach is easily one of the most mysterious characters in One Piece. From his ability to wield two devil fruits, to his ties to the legendary Rocksteady Zebek, there are lots of things that we still need to learn about this guy eventually. But there is one thing about him that has always kind of stood out to me the most, and that's why he doesn't sleep. This was something that was first explained to us during the battle between Roger and Whitebeard, where young Shanks and Buggy noticed that Teach never slept during their 3-day skirmish. For a man who was so adamant about dreams never ending in his introduction, it's extremely ironic that he doesn't even get to have them since he doesn't sleep. It's a great contrast to Luffy, who can even sleep while he eats, or even Ace or Garp, who fall asleep randomly, and Blackbeard has held each of those two captive at some point in time. But something that I think a lot of people forget is that the idea of people not sleeping was actually foreshadowed way back in Drum Kingdom, where Luffy said that people from snowy countries don't sleep, and that they would die if they did. And I'm fairly certain that this is a reference to Blackbeard, since not only was he first ever mentioned towards the end of Drum Kingdom, which is also a snowy island, but Oda even showed us an image of him as a kid crying under the moon, potentially being upset because he's unable to sleep or something. So it's likely that Blackbeard is from the group that Luffy is referring to. Now, to be fair, Luffy did say people in snowy countries in kind of a general sense, but I don't think it's a huge stretch to think that there's like one specific island or tribe or something that this actually applies to, because we've seen a number of snowy islands already and nobody else has mentioned not sleeping. And on top of that, Luffy said he overheard it from a guy in a bar, so he may not have all the details anyway. And I mean, he's Luffy. The fact that he remembered this much is already kind of impressive. He needed Robin to remind him that Marco looked like a pineapple. And I also think it's kind of fair to assume that this man from the bar Luffy is referring to is red-haired Shanks, who obviously has a very deep past with Blackbeard, since that's also who gave Shanks his famous scar. In fact, that scar came before Shanks ever met Luffy back in Fuchsia Village, and presumably told him about the people from snowy countries. And this was also well before Teach had either of his devil fruits that he has today. And you know, Shanks told Whitebeard that he was taking Blackbeard seriously when that scar happened. This wasn't some simple underestimation. So we have to ask what Teach had up his sleeve to make that happen. And I doubt it's going to be as simple as these Wolverine claws. Instead, I think we're going to find out that this whole no sleeping thing is almost like a trump card for Blackbeard. Because Luffy may have said that these people die when they sleep, but what if that's not all that happens? For example, when the minks use Sulong form, they can also die from overexhaustion if they don't know how to use it. But those who train and master it can control it and live. Or maybe it's something like Cavendish, who turns into Hakuba when he falls asleep, who is much faster and more powerful, but kind of kills people indiscriminately. And there are some other examples that we're going to point to throughout this video as well, because Oda has slowly sprinkled bits and pieces of information here and there that I think might help explain not just what Teach's sleeping powers are, but also what may have happened to his people and how rocks maybe got involved. But before we dive into all that, let me tell you about the sponsor for today's video, World of Warships. One thing that I wish we got a lot more of in One Piece are actual large-scale at-sea battles, which is what I really like about World of Warships, because this free-to-play naval warfare-themed game lets us try our hand at a realistic version of those. And while they may not have Pluton as an option, they have added some amazing ships recently, such as Godzilla vs. Kong battleships. And they add new content every month, such as even more ships, in-game nations, or cosmetics. The graphics are also top-notch, and there are several types of ships to choose from, including battleships, destroyers, aircraft carriers, or even submarines. Since launch, they've actually added over 600 ships across 10 different nations. And these ships are based on historical documents and actual blueprints from the first half of the 20th century. And you're able to play as either a lone wolf or along with your friends on either PC or console. So make sure to download World of Warships using the first link down in the description, and also be sure to use promo code BRAVO to receive a starter pack including 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium account time, and a free ship once you complete 10 battles. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring, but let's get back to the video. So if Blackbeard does get some kind of power up from sleeping, this might be why Shanks went out of his way to warn Whitebeard. He may be the only one who really knows the truth about it, since he saw it happen firsthand. In fact, do you remember when Ace went to go meet Shanks and thank him for saving Luffy, and he found him on a mountain in a snowy country? What if this place is just Blackbeard's homeland, and maybe Shanks was here just kind of studying Teach's past, and maybe some way to defeat him down the line? And we actually know a little bit about this island, mainly that it's called Yukiryu Island, which can be translated as Snow Dragon because of its dragon-esque rock formation. transformations. And if Shanks really was here researching Blackbeard's past, it would make a whole lot of sense that Ace was the one to come meet him here, since these two people have both had substantial conflicts with Blackbeard. And this might be why he also went to talk to the Gorosei about a certain pirate as well, which would also explain why St. J. Garcia Saturn told Katarina Devon that he knew Teach's lineage was special. And Devon even rebutted by asking, "Oh, you know about that?" as if it's some kind of secret that not a lot of people know. And there's been a lot of theories about this, maybe pertaining to rocks or something about his weird body, which honestly could still definitely tie in as well, but the snow country thing might be the simplest answer. Because, you know, the Gorosei have a long, dark history of wiping out certain races, like the Lunarians or Buccaneers, and maybe Blackbeard's from yet another one of those countries that they tried doing that too. I mean, we haven't really heard of anyone else from this snow country that never sleeps, so it might kind of make sense. And I mean, the Celestial Goons have had native cleansing festivals every 3 years for crying out loud, so maybe Teach's country was just the target of one of those, thus leaving him as like the last surviving member, a la King for the Lunarians or Kuma for the Buccaneers. And that might be the real reason that he was crying in that panel as a kid. It might be easy to assume he's crying because, you know, he can't sleep or he's cold or something like that, but what if it's because he's just alone, being the last one of his kind, or maybe he's being chased or persecuted because of his lineage, which reminds me a lot of the Orochi flashback actually, because he and the rest of the Kurozumi were persecuted just because of their lineage, and Orochi even said specifically that he was so scared he couldn't sleep, and things only turned around for him when he met Higurashi, who even gave him the mythical Yamata no Orochi Zone fruit, one that grants him a form with 8 heads, a good parallel to Blackbeard who has 8 crossbones on his Jolly Roger. But there's kind of two main things I think we can pull from this. The first being that if Orochi started with a Zone fruit, then maybe Teach did too and we just don't know yet. And the other thing being that if someone guided Orochi to get these powers and take this path in life, then maybe someone did the same with Blackbeard. And now maybe some of you are immediately thinking that Rox would have to be the one to kind of parallel Higurashi in this way, but the thing is, Teach was only 2 years old when Rox died at God Valley. And I do have a few ideas for how this might work, but I'm gonna save those for the very end just because I think we need to hone back in on this whole no sleeping thing first. Because what if the sort of inversion to the Orochi flashback is that Teach wasn't being hunted down by other people because of his family lineage, but what if it was his family that was the one hunting him down because of something he did to them? I mean, we kind of already had this with Whitebeard, right? That crew was as literal of a pirate family as you're gonna find outside of Whole Cake Island. So maybe Teach had something similar happen when he was younger, and maybe it's because he fell asleep one time. Maybe he couldn't control the power back then, sort of like the Minx and Sulong, and he just wiped everyone out. Somewhat like we saw with Hakuba and Cavendish, where after Cavendish fell asleep, Hakuba would straight up annihilate people all over town at night. He was so fast that they said it was like gusts of wind slashing through town. And even in the Colosseum, Cavendish could just tap into it whenever he wanted and go on a rampage. Now, I doubt Teach is gonna have like the same exact thing going on because it would be kind of repetitive, but the parallel is definitely a strong one. And I think this is something that I've been hearing about since like I first got caught up on the manga, and I know one of my first viewers on the channel, my guy Growth Stonks, has been trying to get me on this agenda since day one, and I think I'm on board because one crucial thing is that later in Dressrosa, we saw Cavendish could kind of control Hakuba. It was like there were conflicting wills within the same body, but one had to win out, which ended up being Cavendish, and that even let him consciously use Hakuba's advanced speed and strength. This kind of reminds me of how Zone awakenings are supposed to work. Not that I think Hakuba is the result of one or anything, it's going to be something special I would imagine, but it's just like the general idea that when you awaken a Zone fruit, there's a chance you lose control. Like the will overtakes you kind of, as we saw with the Jailer Beast. Or conversely, in the case of Lucci, he was actually able to control it and get all the buffs that come with it. This probably ties to the fact that Zone fruits have a will of their own, as we learned from the Gorosei with Luffy's fruit. So in a very similar way, I think it's fair to say that Cavendish and Hakuba are like conflicting wills within the same body, which is a very similar thing. We kinda saw Cavendish have that internal struggle in real time with Hakuba, where we even got this dope panel of them each controlling half of the body. So I wonder if Blackbeard might have the same sort of thing going on when he falls asleep. Because as we saw with Cavendish, he was able to learn how to control it eventually, but it obviously took some time to learn. Which also kind of reminds me of how Sulong form is supposed to work, where it took extensive training to control and harness those abilities, but without it, you would just go on a rampage and die after exhaustion. So for Blackbeard, maybe the reason that people from snowy countries die if they sleep isn't just that they die immediately, but their ensuing transformation leads to death afterward because none of them can really control it, except for maybe Blackbeard, and perhaps that's the secret sauce that hurt Shanks all those years ago. Which again, it's not that Teach is gonna have Sulong specifically, it's just that there's some connection here to be made. I mean, even right after Luffy mentioned the no sleeping thing to Sanji during Drum Island, they were attacked by Lapins, which if you don't remember, these things are essentially giant carnivorous but intelligent rabbits, which given their red eyes and white fur, might have a decent resemblance to Sulong form, and maybe in particular Carrot since she's a rabbit mink, and she was also the first Sulong we really got to see in the story. And in addition to that, you know, when Beppo finally used his Sulong form, it was against Blackbeard, and that's what let him save Law. Now, obviously this was kind of different because it was thanks to Chopper's drugs instead of the moon, but still. And Teach even knew what Sulong was back then, which shouldn't be super surprising. I mean, he even knew about Lunarians on Amazon Lily, but still maybe notable. Plus, generally speaking, Sulong is tied to a full moon, which, you know, is at nighttime and when people usually sleep, so there might be a connection there. And when we saw Teach crying as a kid, he was crying at a crescent moon instead of a full moon. What if he's crying because he needed a full moon instead? Or maybe he's waiting for some other celestial cycle to happen so that he can sleep peacefully. But maybe the craziest connection here to all of this is that, you know, the last fruit we kind of expect Teach to get is a Zoan fruit. He already has a Logia and Paramecia, and with 3 skulls on his flag, it only makes sense to get the 3rd type, right? And you know, so far I've made comparisons to Sulong form, which are humanoid animals, as well as Hakuba, whose internal struggle for control kind of mirrors that of a Zoan awakening. So we're already kind of flirting with a Zoan-esque ability already. So what if this is all just leading to the truth that Blackbeard has had his Zoan powers from the very beginning, but he can only access them by sleeping? And maybe that's the power that Shanks saw during their battle and how he got that specific scar. And maybe most importantly, what if it's not a devil fruit exactly, but instead something like what we've recently seen with the Gorosei, because they have not yet been said to have devil fruits, but were instead fully introduced with Wano-style Oda boxes, just giving the name of the creature they actually are. And these things were summoned using pentagram circles as well, which is just odd compared to any other methods we've seen before. They seem like mythical zones, but are almost more like the real deal instead of just a person with the devil fruit, which is something I talked about a lot more in this video here. So what if Teach is able to access a similar state, but just by sleeping? This could all just be one big parallel to Luffy as well, because he died before activating Gear 5th for the first time and coming back with the Drums of Liberation. We saw his heart flatline, and if people from snowy countries really die if they sleep, then maybe Teach sleeping triggers an awakening of some kind in a very similar way. Maybe he activates it like Luffy, but has powers closer to the Gorosei, or something like that. And to make that even a little bit spicier, you know, Luffy's quote-unquote death is where we first learned that he supposedly had a zone this entire time, but we just didn't know. So maybe when Blackbeard sleeps and quote-unquote dies, he will also show us a zone that he secretly had this entire time. And I mean, honestly, even if you go back to the chapter right before Saturn revealed his form for the first time, it looks like he fell asleep. Now, the anime might clue us into what actually happened there, but I mean, we see Saturn like this at the end of 1093, and then the very next time we see him in 1094, he's looking like this. So I think, ironically, there's a chance that in order for the Gorosei and maybe Blackbeard to awaken, they need to sleep. And like I said toward the beginning, this would just be some beautiful irony because Blackbeard talked about dreams never ending in his introduction. Even for the man who doesn't sleep and can't have literal dreams, he still doesn't stop dreaming in the broader sense of the word. It kind of reminds me of this quote from T.E. Lawrence, reading that all men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their minds wake up in the day to find it was a vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. Or maybe even this quote from Willie Caron, who's a physicist from the One Piece world, who said, "Everything that humans can imagine is a possibility in reality." This is basically what I believe Teach is all about, because the dreams you have when you sleep are just that, dreams. But when you're able to treat the reality in front of you like a dream, that's what's truly dangerous. Teach doesn't need the somewhat fake sleeping dreams, because his in real life are big enough as it is. And I wonder if turning that dream into reality is part of his ability when he does actually sleep. And I think there are a lot more deeper thematic layers to to this specifically tied to the underworld, because I think most of us already know that Luffy and Teach are like two sides of the same coin, for so many different reasons. I mean, we first saw this with the pies and drinks back in Mocktown, and now we see this even with their devil fruits, one having the darkness fruit and one being that of the sun god. They contrast like light and dark, and even evil and good. And Teach is likely from a snowy country, which, by virtue of being cold, could probably use a little bit more sun. Now, I know there's a lot more that goes into the climate than just that, but you get what I mean. And the one thing that we know for sure about the One Piece underworld is that it's also cold. That's how Brook has ice attacks, and likely the same for V Nostro. I mean, hell, even Emu had a freezer that held a giant straw hat inside, and Oars, the quote-unquote devil, was kept in a giant freezer after dying in a cold place 500 years ago. So Oda has built connection upon connection between like the cold, darkness, and the underworld, and that's why Teach being at the epicenter of all that just makes so much sense. I mean, even his newest crew member, Kuzan, has the powers of the Ice fruit, which is ironic in its own way. But conversely, Luffy's character focuses on the exact opposite things. Like, instead of being tied to the cold, Luffy has tons of ties to warmth, such as his brother sharing the flame fruit, for example. And instead of being tied to darkness, Luffy is the freaking sun god. And instead of being tied to the underworld, Luffy just being like a liberator and a god to the people kind of opposes the underworld stuff right away. He's trying to save people and stop them from going to the underworld, at least so quickly. And that's why Blackbeard's battle versus Luffy will be absolutely peak. But let's go ahead and break down what Blackbeard's special sleeping zone form could be like, because the Gorosei forms were pretty badass, and Fear Fifth is also pretty dope, so I'm sure Oda has something amazing planned for Blackbeard. And I think the most crucial place to start is probably with the scar that he gave Shanks. Because while we do know Blackbeard used claws to fight back then, I don't think there's any way that those were the difference maker. Instead, I think those claws act as like a foreshadow for what the zone form will eventually be, because the zone form probably also has claws just like that. But before I give my first answer for this, I really want to emphasize that I doubt Teach will be tied to just one creature in particular. Instead, I think it's probably going to be a mix of them. I mean, many yokai or mythological creatures in general are kind of already like combinations of different animals. I mean, for example, St. J. Garcia Saturn is a Gyuki, which is essentially an ox head on a spider's body. And Teach has the 3 skulls on his flag, so maybe it's like 3 different creatures merged together. Or maybe he can swap between 3 different ones or something. But anyway, the first quote-unquote zone form that I think will be involved here is actually going to be a bear, specifically a black bear, which is perfect for Blackbeard, almost making him like Black Bear D, technically. And I don't just say this because of the pun or the claw factor, but also because of the Ace novel, where we actually saw Teach wearing a bear mask during one of their missions. Even earlier in the novel, he was described to be as big as a bear. And then when you factor in the claws that he used back then back into the equation, it all just sort of fits. I mean, Teach wearing that bear mask already kind of reminds me of like Garp wearing the dog mask, which, you know, Garp may have that dog in him, but he doesn't have dog powers. But we did see later on that the Shandia chief, who looks just like Garp, also had a very similar dog mask. So that was kind of a clear symbol to us that they're connected somehow. So maybe this bear mask is also foreshadowing some type of connection. Plus, who did we last see Blackbeard fighting and run from? Beppo, a freaking polar bear, and one who used a forced Sulong form at that, which could be somewhat of a way to think of Blackbeard's powers as well, where he can just sleep and force that form to occur. But you know, polar bears are white, as are Sulong minks in general, so having Blackbeard be like a dark version of that would just be pretty cool. And I think there could even be a tie to Kuma here, who has a fair number of bear connections himself, including styling his hair into bear ears and having the paw fruit, because we recently learned that Kuma is actually a buccaneer, and that they have special blood. We don't know what's special about it just yet, but we just know that it is special because it was mentioned several times. And Marco did say that Teach's weird body may be what let him have multiple devil fruits, so maybe there's some kind of connection there. And I don't think it'd be very surprising if we eventually found out that the buccaneer blood is what led to Vegapunk's invention of green blood, which essentially allows one to duplicate paramecia powers into the seraphim. And that's kind of relevant since, you know, the second fruit that Blackbeard got was also a paramecia in the Gura Gura no Mi. And in addition to that, Vegapunk was about to say something special that the Buccaneers did at one point in the past, but he was cut off. Perhaps Oda is leaving this ambiguous because this will come into play later on with Blackbeard, and he's just sort of setting it up now so it's not as much of a surprise. I mean, Teach and Kuma do have some aesthetic similarities as well, where they both skip leg day and have similar hair. I mean, I know I spoke a lot earlier about Teach being from a snow country, but it could also just be that he has lineage factor from both of these races. Maybe that's why he's special in the eyes of Katarina Devon. But then as for the other creatures that may be involved with Blackbeard's Zoan form, how about a hippo? And the first reason for this is that when Oda gave us the worst generation spirit animals, Teach was given the hippo, and he's even drawn cover art with him and a hippo in the same image. On top of that, in chapter 19, which was not so coincidentally titled Devil's Fruit, we see Luffy and a hippo together on the cover, and the hippo even has a swirl on his head, which is like the one trait that every Devil Fruit design shares. And we actually met a type of hippo on Drum Island as well, known as the woolly hippo, which Wapol used to ride around on. And you know, since Teach was first mentioned in this arc, and Luffy mentioned the no sleeping thing here, this could be interesting to consider as well. I mean, we even have this other cover page with Crocodile and Mr. One having hippos in their entourage, and that might be kinda key because, you know, Blackbeard replaced Crocodile among the warlords. And a hippo would make a lot of sense for Teach because first off, they're dangerous as hell and very aggressive, but also, despite being near water most of the time, they actually can't even swim, which is fitting for someone like Teach who has multiple Devil Fruit powers. And in addition to that, hippos even have 3 chambers to their stomach, which is maybe tied to how Teach got 2 fruits successfully. And then maybe another Zoan form that could be involved in Teach's powers might be the Kraken, or the octopus, which I know I first heard from my guy Threevil, and now I think almost everyone has, and one of the main reasons for this is that Teach has 8 crossbones on his Jolly Roger, and obviously octopi or Kraken have 8 limbs, and I think most Pirates of the Caribbean fans probably already know the importance of Krakens in pirate folklore. And like I said earlier, maybe it's just a combination of all these, because Blackbeard does have the 3 skulls on his Jolly Roger. Maybe he's got a bear, Kraken, and hippo hybrid or something. Or another popular idea that I've heard is the Baizé tiger, which could potentially tie into his laugh among other things. So who knows, Teach might just be a conglomeration of different important creatures. But maybe the bigger question that we need to ask about this is just like, how did Blackbeard even get this special Zoan form to begin with? Does it just come like automatic with everyone born in the snow country? Or was it like a power that Blackbeard acquired after the fact because his no sleeping attribute was advantageous? Well, I could potentially see both, but I really hope that it's the latter, because if this is simply a power that a whole race of people had, it might not seem that special. But if instead it's a power that Blackbeard was given, or maybe that he sought out because him not sleeping was a perfect fit for it, that would hit a lot harder. Because if it is true that this form is accessed by sleeping, well, Teach would only do so when he loses, right? It would be perfect for someone from his race because it would only get activated in crucial situations. That's what truly makes it an amazing trump card. It's like a last resort. And I bet that this is actually where Rox and Blackbeard's connection begins. Because like I said before, Teach was only 2 years old when Rox died. Yet somehow Teach has his will today. And I doubt it's going to be as simple as like Teach is Rox's child, because if so, Whitebeard or any other Rox pirate should have known about this, or at least recognized the similarities by now. And I think them just being father and son would be a little anticlimactic anyhow. Plus, let's compare it to Roger. He was convinced that his kid would be the one to find the One Piece in the future, but obviously he ended up being wrong. Instead, that's going to be Luffy, who was influenced by Roger in a much more roundabout way because Roger caused the Great Age of Pirates. But there was also some layer of directness to it because of Shanks, who obviously also inherited Roger's will on some level and helped pass that on to Luffy. So I think Rox is going to be similar, but the opposite. Where Roger thought his kid would do it, I bet Rox knew that it was unlikely that his would. I bet Rox knew that the next goat was going to be born somewhere else instead, and so he sought to make sure that that kid inherited his will, which is really important because in Roger's case, Ace didn't even really have Roger's will at all. He despised Roger. He wanted Whitebeard to become the Pirate King, which just goes to show that it takes way more than lineage factor to inherit a will, although oftentimes it does help, but it doesn't really matter at all if the will isn't inherited. And unlike Roger, whose words about the One Piece were spread around the world, Rox was basically erased from history. So how did Rox influence Blackbeard when he was only 2 years old by his death? And also, how would anyone have known that Teach was the one worth betting on? I mean, Shanks sacrificed his arm to bet it on the new era after hearing Luffy say the same words as Roger, as well as eating this legendary devil fruit. But what led Rox or somebody like that to potentially make a bet on Blackbeard? Well, I basically have like 3 different options here, and admittedly each one is a bit crazier than the next. So for the first one, if we were to try keeping this whole Shanks and Luffy parallel going with maybe Rox and Blackbeard, then maybe Rox also had a Shanks-like apprentice that sailed around after his death, maybe found Teach, and then influenced him in a very similar way that Shanks did to Luffy. I think something like this is possible, but the thing is, the person who makes the most sense to be Rox Rox's version of Shanks is just Teach. Shanks and Blackbeard are already rivals, and they're from the same generation. Now yes, Teach is technically a part of the worst generation like Luffy, but he and Shanks are basically the same age and even fought as apprentices. So I don't think that there was a messenger of sorts to pass the torch for Rox like there was Shanks for Roger, but rather I think it was just somehow Rox himself. Because what I find particularly important about this is that Roger wasn't around to see his son or even Luffy be born. He literally could not have been there to influence them directly. He needed someone like Shanks to do it for him, and giving Luffy the hat was sort of a declaration that he found the one he thought could accomplish his dream, since Luffy had the very same one. But Teach was actually alive before Rox died. They potentially could have had at least some kind of connection, even if Teach wasn't fully grown up yet. So for the second option here, I think we should go take a look back at God Valley, where the Celestial Dragons were holding their native cleansing festival that they hold every 3 years. That means that they've been going island to island, wiping out certain races as they felt fit. And Teach was 2 years old at this point, which means that there was another native cleansing 1 year before Teach was born. So what if that one occurred on Blackbeard's home island, and maybe Rox somehow saved them from that event, or at least only saved Teach's immediate family? Because if Rox was at God Valley, it shouldn't be that shocking to think that he would have had interest in the other native cleansings that were happening over the course of his pirate career. Or maybe the first one he ever found out about was at Teach's island, and that sort of inspired him to try and stop the Celestial Dragons at God Valley 3 years later. Now we know most of the Rox crew went to go get that treasure, but still, there might be more to it. But if that was the case, it would kind of paint Rox in sort of a positive light, right? And that's interesting compared to the negative light he's had cast on him by the likes of Sengoku. And that kind of makes sense because Rox was against the terrible Celestial Dragons, and Roger and Garp fought to protect them. But the key here is that Teach would not have been born by the time the cleansing before God Valley happened, since he was born about a year afterward. So what I think could be going on here is that Rox may have saved Teach's family from that cleansing, which then made him kind of like a folk hero of some kind to those people, which is somewhat reminiscent of Kuma, who looked up to Dragon before joining the Revolutionary Army. There were stories printed about how he was saving people or whatever, so Kuma kind of looked up to him fondly. So maybe Rox's will was passed on in a very similar way, where people were just telling Teach about Rox as he was growing up, because to them, Rox was kind of their savior. Or maybe Rox even stopped by from time to check up on them and met Teach here or there when he was an infant, which kind of reminds me of Whitebeard, who secretly helped Sphinx Island by sending them money. I mean, we actually have seen a sketch of Teach's mom before, as well as his two sisters. Oda shared this with us in volume 8 of the One Piece magazine, and sure, these are just sketches, but I think it gives us a little bit of insight into what Oda's thinking for Blackbeard's backstory. I wonder if these three are the only ones that Rox was able to save from that cleansing before God Valley, and then maybe Teach was just born later on. But if neither of the last two options I just listed are it, then I do have a third one. And now admittedly, this one's a bit more out there, but I'm expecting something pretty insane for the Rox and Blackbeard flashback, so maybe it'll work. And the reason why I like this one is because Rox and Blackbeard seem to both be revolving around devil fruits, maybe more than any other characters. For Blackbeard, I think that's pretty obvious, but for Rox, it seemed like that whole crew went to God Valley to go get those fruits. I mean, at least for the case of Big Mom, that's the first thing she went for. So I think it would make a lot of sense that the connection between Rox and Blackbeard revolves around a devil fruit. Now, of course, the dark fruit is somehow involved in this, but as far as how they made their initial connection, I think there's actually a different one that could be the answer. Like, for example, Bonnie's age fruit, because this might solve the problem of Teach only being 2 years old when Rox died. And you know, I mean, Blackbeard did kidnap Bonnie at one point, so there's already some sort of connection there. And her powers have really increased in importance lately, with even Saturn using an extract from that fruit to run his twisted experiments, where he tried seeing if powers could be given to a baby without feeding the fruit normally. And part of the reason for this was because the younger you are, the more potential you have, or the more potential future outcomes you still have, because your future isn't nearly as set in stone as it would be if you were older. So what if Rox also knew about this and used it to find the ultimate protege by basically just checking all of their futures? It's sort of like an inversion to how the government went door to door in the South Blue looking for Roger's child. Maybe Rox went door to door in the Snow Country looking for the kid with the most potential, so then he could sort of guide them and carry his will. Maybe he or one of his minions who had those powers just aged them up to sort of see their futures and saw that Teach was the most impressive one of all. And maybe when they were aged up temporarily, he was even able to converse with them in their their older state and explain what was going on, which would be really crazy if you think about it. And maybe the one holdup to this idea would be that it's not super clear yet whether the age fruit also ages up one's mental state as well as the physical. Now, what we do know is that older people who get de-aged still retain their cognitive abilities, so it's not like you mentally become a baby in that case. But now, whether younger people who get aged upward get a mental boost still isn't certain, I think. Our best example is probably Bonnie, who is actually 12 years old but is pretending to be 24. And given that she successfully snuck around the Reverie and was a pirate on the Grand Line for 2 years, I get the feeling that the mental boost is there as well. It would be a good tie to Momonosuke too, who was aged up physically by Shinobu's Rot fruit, but he still has the mental capacity of an 8-year-old. I think it would just make a lot of sense for Bonnie to fix that eventually with her powers. Or maybe it would take her awakening to do so, I don't know. But let's just say for argument's sake that it does age you up mentally. Couldn't Rox have like aged up Teach as a baby and then literally just talked to him? I mean, shoot, maybe he aged Teach into like his ultimate future form as like definitive proof of his true potential and just told him like, hey, if you listen to me, you're actually going to be able to achieve this form for good, which would be twisted for like so many different reasons. And now maybe some of you are thinking like, how wouldn't the Rox crew have seen this or known about this? And that's definitely a good question. But even at God Valley, we saw Rox running ahead of the rest of the group and separating himself. So maybe this was somewhat of a similar thing where he ran ahead or just went on his own mission or something, and that's when he found Teach. And he may have even picked the snowy country on purpose, because we still need to wonder how Teach even got this special Zoan form, assuming he does have one. And I'm guessing that if this Rox protege idea is even remotely true, then Rox is probably the one who enabled him to use those Zoan powers as some kind of way to help him achieve his goals, which would be a strong parallel to like Higurashi giving Orochi his mythical zone, or even Moria, who waited years for the perfect shadow to put into ores. It was like he needed the perfect specimen before he could launch his plans into action. So maybe Rox basically did the same thing. Maybe he already knew about the summoning circles just like the Gorosei do, and he was able to give Teach one of those forms. I mean, Sengoku did say that Rox was involved in the worst taboos of the world, and I feel like pentagram circles like the Gorosei use would definitely be up there in terms of taboos. And again, the fact that Teach doesn't sleep may have been why he sought out someone from this country specifically. By not sleeping, it would stop the form from ever coming out unless completely necessary. It's like Rox found the perfect protege, but still gave him the ultimate failsafe, which I think that kind of thing just makes so much sense, because stacking the deck in your favor and removing as much uncertainty as possible is how Teach operates to this very day. That element of his will may even be part of what made him the perfect person in Rox's eyes, but also why Whitebeard was certain that Teach wasn't the man Roger was waiting for. But hey, that's it for today, guys. I want to give you all a big thank you for watching, and to our sponsor World of Warships, so please make sure to use my link below to go download the game and use promo code BRAVO to receive a starter pack including 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium account time, and a free ship once you complete 10 battles. And I also recently started a new series over on my second channel where basically another creator and I get on to continue the discussion from this video. So for example, this week Hidden Island and I went in depth on all things Rox D. Xebec, so make sure to click that link above and give that a listen as well. But until next time, later.